I imagine most people listening to this will have seen the movie The Matrix. In case you haven't, I'll briefly explain it. Human beings are used by machines to effectively serve as heat generators. Huge batteries of human beings stored in buildings, specialized buildings that extract the heat and use it to form electricity. So that's how the bodies of the human beings are used. However, so that the human beings don't feel distress and so that they are kind of happy with their situation, they are fed what is essentially a simulated world, which actually looks just like the world we are in. It's a brilliant movie. If you haven't watched it, it's got some fairly deep meaning to it. Anyway, so that's the idea of the Matrix. We live in a simulated world while our real life carries on in some sort of like battery farm for human beings. So I want to highlight something here that has been a problem in philosophy for hundreds of years. So you can see a little man, and this little man, so forget about the squiggly thing outside for the moment. The little man is looking at a tree and he's looking at the sun. And while he looks at those things obviously through his eyes, physics would have it that the rays of light are coming from the sun and the tree and impinging on his eyes, and his brain produces an image of those things. But actually, if you go a little deeper, you'll realize that the only thing that this little man can know is the simulation that his brain is producing. Since it's the brain that does all the work of taking in those sensory impressions and creating some picture of reality from them. So, there are miraculous things happening, like you see something and you hear something at the same time, so the sound and the sight are being coordinated, and maybe even touch or smell. So the brain is producing this simulation that creates the world as we see it. Now the weird thing is that all of this simulation is happening inside the brain, but the brain itself is creating the very things we think are outside and are real. So electromagnetic radiation, light, the sun, the trees, animals, even yourself, even the brain, are all things that are simulated in the brain, which is the squiggly thing on the outside. Now, I've been reading a book recently by a guy called Thomas Metzinger. Very deep book. He's a professor of philosophy, and he's getting quite a bit of notoriety actually. He wrote a book called The Ego Tunnel, and in his own book he warns that the modern research into neuroscience is proving to create some quite disturbing findings if you believe in the usual image of reality as it being out there, the stuff from out there, sound waves, light, hit your body, your eyes and your ears, and then you create a picture of reality. But actually the thing that's creating the picture of reality is part of the simulation. How weird is that? So I'll quote him. This book says, "Our conscious experience of the world is systematically externalized because the brain constantly creates the experiences that I am present in a world outside my brain." Ponder on that. The whole book's like that. It's a very deep book, and he warns in the book that these ideas are potentially a great threat to society and civilization. because he reaches a conclusion which I'll mention at the end of this podcast that is, well, for many people will be quite disturbing. Anyway, this is the reality of our life. We live in a simulation where part of the simulation, i.e. the brain, is creating the simulation. And that is not a situation that is easily understood, and people are still struggling with that. But the reality is you cannot know what is really out there, because what is out there is a simulation created by your brain. There is no out there. There is no time and no space. Time and space are properties of your consciousness. Let me quote a couple of philosophers. Schopenhauer fully comprehended this. He said, "The world is my representation." In other words, it's a thing that my mind or my brain, and this thing about whether the brain is the mind is not something I want to get into, because it's not something we can answer. But anyway, whichever word you want to use, brain, mind, the world is my representation. It's one of the most famous quotes from philosophy. In other words, your world is a representation being created by your mind, and that representation includes your brain. Kant, who deals with this in a very, very detailed and meticulous manner, says all objects of experience possible to us are nothing but appearances, that is, mere representations, which have no independent existence outside our thoughts. That tree that you're looking at, or whatever you're looking at, doesn't exist outside of your thoughts, outside of your consciousness. And you can say, well, I can go and touch it. Well, that sense of touch does not exist outside of your consciousness. Does that mean there's nothing out there? Well, it's a funny question. Obviously something's going on, but out there is a property of your consciousness, and I'll get onto that in a moment. If you really think about these things, you will realize, as the ancients used to say, that reality is a dream. It may be a dream with pain and suffering, but even so, it's a dream. So let me talk about Kant in a little bit more detail. Kant divided the human mind into two parts. One part he called sensibility. Sensibility is the bit that deals with sensory perceptions, effectively. And he shows very conclusively that time and space are properties of our mind. They're not properties of physical reality. But he goes even further to some things that are really, really quite interesting. He creates 12 categories of understanding. I'm not going to go into them, I'm just going to mention one of them. Causality. We believe that causality, cause and effect, exists in the world. For Kant, it doesn't exist in the world, it exists in our mind. The empirical philosophers, people like Hobbes and Locke, actually undermined the physical sciences, and I'll explain how they did it. So if you see someone hitting a nail with a hammer, pretty much simultaneously, if you're quite near to them, you'll hear a banging noise. So you say that the banging noise that you hear is caused by the hammer. So the empiricists say only things which are from our sensory perceptions are real. So the hammer and the nail you can see, they're real, and you hear a banging sound, and that's real. But where's the causal link? You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can't see it. The causal link doesn't exist in physical reality. And when the philosophers understood this, they realized that science was based on a false premise of causality. Because causality says that every effect has a cause. Well, experience teaches us that. But are we then just left saying, well, actually causality is just habit? Every time we see someone hit a nail, we hear a banging noise. This is the old problem. An author called Nassim Taleb wrote a book called The Black Swan. And it's called The Black Swan because prior to people going to Australia, they believed that every swan was white. And then they went to Australia and they found a black swan, which upset their habit of assuming that swans were always white. So anyway, without going into that anymore, what Kant shows, again, through pure thought and argument, is that causality, the link between one thing and another, is actually a property of our minds. It's not a property of out there. Yeah, there is much more to say on that, but I'm not going to go there. It would take too long. But one of the big things with Kant is he talks about a priori knowledge. A priori means knowledge without experience. If you want an example of a priori knowledge, then mathematics. And if you listen to mathematicians like Roger Penrose, who's Professor of Mathematics at Oxford University, he says mathematics is discovered, it isn't invented. Well, whether it's invented or discovered, the point is that mathematics has no representation in the real world. I'll give you a very, very dramatic example. So I imagine most people know what a square root is. If you take the square root of 9, it's 3. In other words, the square root of a number is the number which multiplied by itself gives you the first number. So 3 3s are 9, so 3 is the square root of 9. But you can ask, what is the square root of -1? Well, the square root of 1 is 1, but there are no two numbers you can multiply together to get -1. If you find them, let somebody know, and you'll probably get a Nobel Prize or something. But there is no number that multiplied by itself gives you -1. If you multiply -1 by -1, you get +1. If you can remember, fairly intermediate level mathematics. So the square root of -1 is nothing that is known either in mathematics. We have no representation of it in the number system per se, and it's certainly not known in the natural world. So what mathematicians do is they give it they assign it to the letter I. They just say, we don't know what it is, we'll just call it I. Anyway, there's a whole branch of mathematics called complex numbers, or based around complex numbers, which is numbers involving I, that turns out to be absolutely essential to understanding the natural world. Well, your simulated world. The number I is used in many real-life disciplines, electrical engineering being probably one of the best examples. Without this complex number, as they call it, you wouldn't have your iPhone. They wouldn't have the mathematical tools to design the semiconductors and various electronic components in a phone. How weird is that? A number that doesn't exist in mathematics proper, and definitely doesn't exist in the real world. You cannot have square root of -1 apples. You can have 3 apples, but you cannot have the square root of -1 apples. It doesn't mean anything in the physical reality. But in the mathematics that is used to deal with physical reality, or our simulation to be more accurate, then the number is very, very useful. So lots of puzzling things. Let me go on to the last slide. Oh, if there's a funny gap in this, it's because I accidentally turned it off. Anyway, so the self. The Buddhists have been saying for millennia that there is no self. The really, really disturbing thing about Metzinger is that he now has all the neurological evidence and the philosophy to show that that is indeed the case. You are as much a part of the simulation as the tree that you're looking at, or the car that you can see parked on the road, or whatever. It's a high level simulation, but nonetheless it's a simulation. As he says at the end of his book, and he should have put it at the beginning, this is disturbing analysis. And if you don't want to essentially truly disturb yourself for a couple of weeks while you read something, do not read The Ego Tunnel by Metzinger. There's an example here of the kind of neurological research that's being done. Antonio Damasio, who is a Spinoza fan, by the way, and has written books about Spinoza. Anyway, he's a Portuguese-American neuroscientist, and he's done extensive work to try and understand where this feeling of self comes from. And it turns out that to a large extent it's a map of the body that the brain creates within itself. So when you wake up in the morning and say, nice morning, oh, it's me again. Well, that feeling of me again is actually this map of the body that is contained within the brain. And he got his inspiration from Spinoza, who said, the mind is the idea of the body. And if you don't get that, then neither did I for a long, long time. But if you map it onto what Damasio found, then the mind, we could say, is the map of the body. It's a sad fact that people who have a particular part of their brainstem damaged, they know exactly where this map is created physically in the brain. If this part of the brain is damaged, then this person ends up with no sense of self. A very tragic thing. So there we have it. Now, there are two things to add to all of this. The first one is that a lot of the neuroscience, in my opinion, who am I to criticize, but in the book by Metzinger, some of the neuroscience just sounds a little bit dodgy to me. And he's very honest about it. This is not a complete analysis. And it's a beautiful book because he very often goes back to the old philosophers and their insights and how relevant they are to today and so on and so forth. And the second thing is that Spinoza, who has been proved right on so many things, who clearly had deep intuitions and insights about the nature of reality, insists that the world of mind is wholly separate from the world of what we would call the simulation, or reality, if that's what you want to call it. So the mind and the simulation are wholly different things. And I've got a funny feeling that Spinoza will be proved right in the end. That the reductionism of science, which in truth it really goes nowhere, because all that happens is they find one thing is made of lots of smaller things, and then they look at those smaller things and they find they're made of smaller things, and so on. And so in physics, for example, the fundamental particles in physics, they don't know what they are. All they have for any particular particle is 2 or 3 numbers. It's charge, it's spin, it's mass. And they know virtually nothing else about it. They don't know how it works. So for example, when a photon, a particle of light, is emitted from an electron, they don't know how that happens. All they know is it happens. So to quote William Blake, how does it go? Well, the bit I can remember: to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. That is the nature of the universe. And I don't fully buy into the reductionist view of consciousness and mind. I think Spinoza will probably be proved right in the end.